The Story of the Old Ram.
Every now and then in these days, the boys used to tell me I ought to get one Jim Blaine to tell me the stirring story of his grandfather's old ram. But they always added that I must not mention the matter unless Jim was drunk at the time, just comfortably and sociably drunk. They kept this up until my curiosity was on the rack to hear the story. I got to haunting Blaine, but it was of no use. The boys always found fault with his condition. He was often moderately, but never satisfactorily drunk. I never watched a man's condition with such absorbing interest, such anxious solicitude. I never so pined to see a man uncompromisingly drunk before. At last, one evening I hurried to his cabin, for I learned that this time his situation was such that even the most fastidious could find no fault with it. He was tranquilly, serenely, symmetrically drunk. Not a hiccup to mar his voice, not a cloud upon his brain thick enough to obscure his memory. As I entered, he was sitting upon an empty powder keg with a clay pipe in one hand and the other raised to command silence. His face was round, red, and very serious. His throat was bare and his hair tumbled. In general appearance and costume, he was a stalwart miner of the period. On the pine table stood a candle, and its dim light revealed the boys sitting here and there on bunks, candle boxes, powder kegs, etc. They said, "Shh, don't speak, he's going to commence." I found a seat at once, and Blaine said, "I don't reckon them times will ever come again. There never was a more burlier old ram than what he was. Grandfather fetched him from Illinois, got him of a man by the name of Yates, Bill Yates. Maybe you might have heard of him. His father was a Deacon Baptist, and he was a rustler, too. A man had to get up rusher early to get the start of old Thankful Yates. It was him that put the Greens up to joining teams with my grandfather when he moved west. Seth Green was probably the pick of the flock. He married a Wilkerson, Sarah Wilkerson. Good creature. She was one of the likeliest heifers as ever raised an old Stoddard, everybody said that knowed her. She could heft a barrel of flour as easy as I can flirt a flapjack. And spin? Don't mention it. Independent? When Sile Hawkins came a-browsing around her, she let him know that for all his 10, he couldn't trot and harness alongside of her. You see, Sile Hawkins was, no, it weren't Sile Hawkins after all. It was a galoot by the name of Filkins. I disremember his first name, but he was a stump come into prayer meeting drunk one night, hooraying for Nixon, because he thought it was a primary, and old Deacon Ferguson up and scooted him through the window, and he lit on old Miss Jefferson's head, poor old filly. She was a good soul, had a glass eye, and used to lend it to old Miss Wagner that hadn't any to receive company in. It warn't big enough, and when Miss Wagner warn't noticing, it'd get twisted around in the socket and look up maybe, or out to one side and every which way, while to other was looking as straight ahead as a spyglass. Grown people didn't mind it, but it most always made the children cry. It was so sort of scary. She tried packing it in raw cotton, but it wouldn't work. Somehow the cotton would get loose and stick out and look so kind of awful that the children couldn't stand it no way. She was always dropping it out and turning up her old dead light on the company empty and making them uncomfortable because she could never tell when it hopped out, being blind on that side, you see. So somebody'd have to hunch her and say, "You game eyes fetched loose, Miss Wagner, dear," and then all of 'em would have to sit and wait till she jammed it in again, wrong side before as a gentle thing and green as a bird's egg. Being a bashful creature and easy sot back before company, but being wrong side before warn't much difference anyway, because her own eye was sky blue and the glass one was yeller on the front side, so whichever way she turned it didn't match nohow. Old Miss Wagner was considerable on the borrow, she was. When she had a quilting or Dorcas aside at her house, she generally borrowed Miss Higgins' wooden leg to stump around on. It was considerable shorter than her other pen, but much she minded that. She said she couldn't abide crutches when she had company because they was so slow. Said when she had company and things had to be done, she wanted to get up and hump herself. She was as bald as a jug, and so she used to borrow Miss Jacobs' wig. Miss Jacobs was the coffin peddler's wife, A ratty old buzzard he was that used to go roosting around where people was sick of waiting for him. And there that old rip would sit all day in the shade on a coffin that he judged would fit the candidate. And if it was a slow customer and kind of uncertain, he'd fetch his rations and a blanket along and sleep in the coffin nights. He was anchored out that way in frosty weather for about 3 weeks once before old Robin's place, waiting for him. And after that, for as much as 2 years. Jacobs was not on speaking terms with the old man on account of his disappointing him. He got one of his feet froze and lost money, too, because old Robbins took a favorable turn and got well. And the next time Robbins got sick, Jacobs tried to make up with him and varnished up the same old coffin and fetched it along, but old Robbins was too many for him. He had him in and appeared to be powerful weak. He bought the coffin for $10, and Jacobs was to pay it back and 25 more besides if Robbins didn't like the coffin after he'd tried it. And then Robbins died. And at the funeral, he bursted off the lid and riz up in his shroud and told the parson to let up on the performances because he could not stand such a coffin as that. You see, he'd been in a trance once before when he was young, and he took the chances on another, calculating that if he'd made the trip, it was money in his pocket, and if he missed far, he couldn't lose a cent. And, by George, he sued Jacobs for the rhino and get judgment. And he set up the coffin in his back parlor and said he allowed to take his time. Now, it was always an aggravation to Jacobs, the way that miserable old thing acted. He moved back to Indiana pretty soon, went to Walesville. Walesville was the place the Hoggadorns was from. Mighty fine family, old Maryland stock. Old Squire Hoggadorn could carry around more mixed liquor and cuss better than most any man I ever see. His second wife was the Widder Billings. She said that was Becky Martin. Her dam was Deacon Dunlap's first wife. Her oldest child, Maria, married a missionary and died in grace, ate up by the savages. They ate him too, poor feller, biled him. It warns the custom, so they say, but they explained to friends of his'n that went down there to bring away his things that they'd tried missionaries every other way and never could get any good out of 'em, and so it annoyed all his relations to find out that that man's life was fooled away just out of a darned experiment, so to speak. But mind ye, there ain't anything ever really lost. Everything that people can't understand and don't see the reason of does good if you only hold on and give it a fair shake. Providence don't fire no blank cartridges, boys. That there missionary substance, unbeknownst to himself, actually converted every last one of them heathens that took a chance at the barbecue. Nothing ever fetched him but that. Don't tell me it was an accident that he was biled. There ain't no such a thing as an accident. When my Uncle Lem was leaning up against a scaffolding once, sick or drunk or something, an horseman with a hod full of bricks fell on him out of the 3rd story and broke the old man's back in 2 places. People said there was an accident. Much accident there was about that. He didn't know what he was there for, but he was there for a good object. If he hadn't been there, the horseman would have been killed. Nobody could ever make me believe anything different from that. Uncle Lem's dog was there. Why didn't the horseman fall on the dog? Because the dog would have seen him a-coming and stood from under. That's the reason the dog warns the pilot. A dog can't be depended on to carry out a special providence. Mark my words, it was a put-up thing. Accidents don't happen, boys. Uncle Em's dog, I wish you could have seen that dog. He's a regular shepherd or rusher. He's part bull and part shepherd. Splendid animal. Belonged to Parson Hagar before Uncle Lem got him. Parson Hagar belonged to the Western Reserve Hagar's prime family. His mother was a Watson. One of his sisters married a Wheeler. They settled in Morgan County, and he got nipped by the machinery in a carpet factory and went through in less than a quarter of a minute. His widder bought the piece of carpet that had his remains wove in, and people come 100 miles to tend the funeral. There was 14 yards in the piece. She wouldn't let them roll him up, but planted him just so, full length. The church was middling small where they preached the funeral, and they had to let one end of the coffin stick out the window. They didn't bury him. They planted one end and let him stand up, same as a monument. And they nailed a sign on it and put on it sacred to the memory of 14 yards
a 3-ply carpet containing all that was mortal of William.
Jim Blaine had been growing gradually drowsy and drowsier. His head nodded once, twice, 3 times, dropped peacefully upon his breast, and he fell tranquilly asleep. The tears were running down the boy's cheeks. They were suffocating with suppressed laughter, and had been from the start, though. I'd never noticed it. I perceived that I was sold. I learned then that Jim Blaine's peculiarity was that whenever he reached a certain stage of intoxication, no human power could keep him from setting out with impressive unction to tell about a wonderful adventure which he had once had with his grandfather's old ram, and the mention of the ram in the first sentence was as far as any man had ever heard him get concerning it. He always maundered off interminably from one thing to another, till his whiskey got the best of him and he fell asleep. What the thing was that happened to him and his grandfather's old ram is a dark mystery to this day, for nobody has ever yet found out.